So, in thinking about how we define colorism and why that matters, I want us to understand that language is continuously evolving. And being a former English professor myself, I always remind people that all words are made up words. People say, oh, that's just a word you made up. Well, that was true of every word at some point, right? Humans create language in order to describe our reality. And so we invent language, we invent the words that we use every day. And so colorism has not always existed, but as the phenomenon started to happen, people coined the language in order to describe what they saw happening. And I want to read a quote by James Baldwin in 1979, where he explains the power of language specifically for Black people in that context, but thinking about people who are trying to describe their experiences of oppression or people who are trying to describe their experiences of marginalization. So James Baldwin wrote that people evolve a language in order to describe and thus control their circumstances, or in order to not be submerged by a reality that they cannot articulate. And if they cannot articulate it, they are submerged. And so when I first started writing and speaking and teaching about colorism publicly, in 2011, I had not heard of the term colorism yet. So I had been experiencing it my entire life, but didn't know what it was called, didn't know that there was terminology for it, didn't know how to articulate what I was feeling and experiencing. And so many people that I've met over the past 12 years have said the same thing. When we start talking about colorism, they say, oh yeah, I know what you were talking about. I didn't know that's what it was called. I didn't know that there was language for it. And they talk about how it's kind of a sigh of relief to finally have a word for this thing that they've always experienced. Alice Walker in 1983 is really the first person who started using this term or used this term to describe the phenomenon of people who identify the same racially, have different skin tones, having different experiences based on the color of their skin. Thinking about other terms that people have used to call this phenomenon, before colorism really gained traction as the go-to terminology, people were using things like skin tone bias or skin tone prejudice, right, or skin color prejudice. People also use color struck, right? So they describe someone who is someone who perpetuates colorism. Sometimes they would call them color struck. And then other words like shadeism. Shadeism, I think, is a good synonym. It's not as common or as widely used, but people have used shadeism. And thinking about how this term has evolved over time, I also just want to quickly note that terms like texturism or hairism and featureism are closely related to colorism, even though they are unique. So that's another example of how people have created these terms, coined these terms to describe their reality, to describe the issue that was happening in society, in the culture, that they needed the language to be able to articulate. And so over the years, I started to distinguish more often between colorism and hairism and featureism. But back in the day when I first started talking about colorism, I was including all of those features, all of those racialized. And so in terms of the definition of colorism, I define it as a social system that privileges people with lighter skin and marginalizes people with darker skin. Okay. So within that system, individuals and groups with lighter skin tones benefit from such things as, this is not an inclusive list, but some of the privileges that you might have if you have lighter skin include preferences, explicit and implicit preferences for lighter skin, compounding generational advantages, right? So if you descend from, if you have white or European ancestors or lighter skin European ancestors, you are benefiting from that generational privilege as well. And then things like practices or cultural norms that cater to whiteness. And so thinking about, for example, the pulse oximeter that measures oxygen in the blood, where the darker your skin tone, the more pigmentation, the more melanin you have in your skin, the more inaccurate that really is, right? And so those with lighter skin tones don't run into that as a factor. And then other things like designs and structures created for whiteness. I think about technology a lot in terms of like facial recognition software and how it disproportionately fails to recognize or misinterprets right, the faces and the features of people with darker skin tones. So a lot of people who believe that reverse colorism is a thing or that that is a real system in place, they define colorism as a form of bullying, right? And so their definition of colorism might be something like disliking someone with their skin tone, right? Or they might think of colorism or define colorism as being mean to someone because of their skin tone or based on their skin tone, right? And so if you understand colorism as a social system with systemic and structural and institutional advantages for people with a certain skin tone and systemic, historical, generational disadvantages and oppression for people with dark skin tones, then you really can't even conceive of such a thing as reverse colorism, right? Or colorism goes both ways. And so I use the Robin Hood analogy a lot. I talk about how we don't consider Robin Hood stealing from the rich to give to the poor as reverse classism. A lot of times we conceive of that phenomenon as a backlash to classism or a response to classism or someone trying to navigate the system in which rich people have all of the resources and all of the capital and poor people have been left without, right? And so you might think it's wrong to steal from rich people, right? You might think it's wrong to mistreat someone. You might think it's wrong to be mean to someone because they're rich. But that doesn't constitute a reversal of the entire social system, right? So even if you steal a rich person's car or steal their wallet, they still retain all of their privileges and advantages of being rich, right? And so just like we don't have reverse classism, and we don't have reverse racism, because these are systems, historical systems, systemic structural systems, we also don't have reverse colorism. And so that's one of the main reasons why I want people to really hone in on defining colorism as a social system and not just personal feelings or personal preferences, right? Those aspects are related to colorism. They're a facet of colorism. They have something to do with colorism. But those individual instances are not themselves representative of colorism as a social system. And then the last thing I'll say in terms of defining colorism and why I use terms like lighter and darker, I think it helps us to have more nuance in terms of identifying instances of colorism and understanding colorism cross-culturally and globally. So I received an email once where the person was asking my opinion again on using the term light versus dark and using the term lighter versus darker, right? So just wanting to know why there's a distinction or if the distinction matters. And so I think it's useful in thinking about the entire spectrum of the human skin tones that people, our perceptions of skin tone can be contextual, right? And so in one place or one context or one family or one community, one neighborhood, one country, right, one location, the understanding of what is dark skinned or what is darker skinned might vary. And so it's helpful in order to have a global analysis of colorism to also understand that it's not a binary, right? This light skin versus dark skin dichotomy that we often set up is not as binary as we might assume it is, or we often talk about it being. And so an example of that is I use a lot of analogies, if you don't already know. I use the analogy of standing in a line, right? So if you're standing in a line waiting to get donuts, I use donuts in my analogies a lot because I like donuts. So if we're standing in a line, we have a line of 25 people in line to get donuts, and you're 10th in line, you're number 10 in line, right? What happens a lot of times is people say, well, I'm not number one, I'm not very first in line. And so I don't have any privilege at all, right? Or I'm not in the top five. I'm not the first five people in line. And so it doesn't matter. If I'm number 10, I might as well be number 20. I might as well be number 25. But I say that even if you're not the very first person in line, you're still ahead of several other people, and that positioning matters, right? And so even if you don't see yourself as quote unquote light skinned, If you are lighter than other people in the room, if you are lighter than other people in your family, if you are lighter than other people in your community or your school, you're still going to have privileges relative to those people, right? So you don't have to be the lightest person in the world to still have some form of light skin privilege. The brown paper bag test, what's the origin of that? Okay, great question, Tiffany Hayes. So the brown paper bag test was used as an arbitrary marker in order to discriminate against people with darker skin tones. And it was there are similar tests, like there's the pencil test, the cone test, right? And so it was a way to exclude people with more Afrocentric or what we consider Black features, right? So coilier, more Afro textured hair, darker skin tones, and the pencil test was also a hair texture test. And so people who wanted to hoard or reserve access to institutions, to social clubs, social organizations for people with lighter skin and or mixed race ancestry or more European phenotypes. They implemented things like the paper bag test, the cone test, the pencil test, the blue vein test in order to be exclusive, right? It was a way of being exclusive. And also when I talk about colorism and things like reverse colorism, I want people to know that a lot of light-skinned people in the realm of colorism are not just innocent bystanders. So a lot of times we talk about how a lot of this is a result of European colonization, the legacy of slavery, and how these systems were created by white colonialists. But a lot of our siblings of African descent, of other indigenous ancestry, were active participants in this as well. And they were not just innocent bystanders. They were not just, passive onlookers, right? They actively participated in this type of exclusion and discrimination in order to gain higher positioning in society, right? And so the paper bag test is an example of that. We must talk about colorism as a societal system of privilege and oppression, deep historical roots, and far-reaching socioeconomic impact. And any definition or discussion that does not include that lens is actually making it harder to solve the problem. And we're not actually going to solve the problem if we aren't willing to acknowledge it as a system of historical oppression and also historical privileging. A lot of times I have to say to my fellow dark-skinned people is let's not gaslight ourselves, right? So I'll say that to you now and to any other dark-skinned person listening. We don't have to gaslight ourselves. The rest of the society is more than willing to do that for us. So learn to trust what you're feeling, right? It's a process. You can get better at it over time, but learn to say, no, you're feeling this for a reason.